Good morning, everyone, brave souls, for waking up early and coming here early to this session, but you will not be sorry. It's going to be a great session. My name is Abigail Golden-Vazquez, and I am the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Latinos in Society program. We're a policy program focused on the changing demographic of Latinos in America and how the success of Latinos is going to impact the success of the nation. We focus on 3 policy areas: civic participation, economic advancement, and educational attainment. And of course, we are always happy to bring diverse voices and work together with the diverse groups to find solutions to our shared future and makes America stronger. I am so happy to be hosting this particular panel with fantastic colleagues from the Aspen Institute who will introduce themselves later. I have a couple announcements that I'm required to make. Please shut off all the things that go beep or ring or make noise. Feel free to share what you're hearing on this panel on social media using hashtag AspenIdeas. And also, please, after this panel, use the app, the Ideas Fest app, to rate this session so that the producers of the Ideas Fest will know if you liked the content and will consider creating more things like this, or just tell them what you would like to see more of. I just have to call out really briefly, sorry, Woody Hunt, who's in the audience, a supporter of the Aspen Institute Latinos in Society program and a supporter of creating more awareness of Latino issues and border issues in the country. So thank you, Woody, for all you do. And Michelle, too. We have the mayor of Topeka, Kansas, a Boricua in the audience. So now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for this panel, Alex Wagner. She wears many hats. She does. She's co-host and executive producer of The Circus on Showtime, a very popular series right now. She's a national correspondent on CBS News and has covered issues on the border. And she's a contributing editor of The Atlantic. She's also an author of a brand new book, which you can also buy here.
Yes, you sure can.
Called Future Face, A Family Mystery and Epic Quest and the Secret to Belonging, which touches on many of the themes we'll be addressing in this session today. So, Alex.
Thank you, Abigail, for that unfortunately lengthy intro. My fault, not yours. I just want to have everybody on the panel introduce themselves, keeping in mind that brevity is the soul of wit. Erik Liu, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I'm Erik Liu. I am the director of the Aspen Institute program on citizenship and American identity. I also run a nonprofit called Citizen University, which we'll talk about more as we go.
Good morning. I'm Mohamed Abdel-Kader. I'm the executive director of the Stevens Initiative at the Aspen Institute.
I've introduced myself, so I will.
Sure. Hi, I'm Erik Stegman. My family's from the Carry the Kettle First Nation up in Saskatchewan. My mom grew up on the Blackfeet Reservation, and I run the Center for Native American Youth here at the Aspen Institute.
Thank you, lady and gents. So let's get right to it. It is an incredible moment to be having a conversation about what defines Americans. Yesterday, the Supreme Court upheld President Trump's travel ban, which seemed to say one thing about where we're headed as a country. And then last evening, Joe Crowley, a 10-term white male U.S. congressman, was defeated soundly, double digits, by a 28-year-old socialist Latina named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We seem to be, I mean, you could get whiplash from looking at sort of the back and forth in the debate. And it's not just a rhetorical debate, it's a substantive policy debate about what our values are in this country and who fundamentally belongs here. I want to start with you, Abigail. When you saw, how did you process yesterday?
Well, whiplash is a good way to describe it. I would also call it an emotional roller coaster. So obviously the Supreme Court decision, or maybe not obviously for some, but the Supreme Court decision to uphold the Muslim ban for me was heartbreaking and a huge step backwards for what our democracy stands for. And then the dissent by Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor was just a powerful and welcome response. But I wanted to point out something that I noticed, since this is also about it's about what's going on in the world, but it's also about identity and how we are perceived. Different groups of us are perceived in the world, and so it was very notable to me. Fortune headlined Sonia Sotomayor's response as, strong response from Justice Sotomayor, something along those lines. And the New York Times writes, fiery response from Sonia Sotomayor. And I was like, okay, so the old stereotype, the trope of the fiery Latina in the headline of the New York Times. And so these things are, take little chips at whether how you're perceived, how you're represented, and whether or not you belong.
Right.
And so that really struck me.
I do want to drill into Ocasio-Cortez's win, because she is a 28-year-old Latina, and we have the mayor here. Do you see? I mean, how do you read this moment and the wins that we're seeing on the part of minority candidates? The announcement of candidacies written more broadly.
There are more people of color and more women and more young people running for office than ever before. So I do think there is a movement afoot. Will it counter the other movement that's going on? That's really hard to say, but I think this is an omen for what we're going to see more of this. But at the same time, candidates that Trump has been supporting have also been winning. So, we have these extremes going on. But you're going to see a lot more women, and you're going to see a lot more people of color, and Latinos in particular, running for office and winning.
I wonder, Erik, Lou, actually, I'd like all of you guys to answer this in some fashion. This is all happening against the backdrop of an immigration crisis at the U.S. border, which, again, gets to this fundamental idea of who belongs here. Do you see this moment in American politics as a new chapter or another part of a narrative that has been unfolding for a very long time?
I actually see it more as the latter. We have been through this before. We have been through this kind of passage. Actually, the scale of immigration in the United States over the last decade or two is still, as a proportion of the population, less than what it was at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. We are in what you could call the second Gilded Age, which means we already had a Gilded Age in this country. We already had a period where you had simultaneously this incredible demographic shift and this incredible stretching apart of inequality and concentration of wealth and voice that's created all of the economic and cultural anxiety of the politics today, right? So I look at that and say, we've been through this before, which suggests to me we are capable of navigating it. What is different, however, is that the passages before, the waves of immigration before, were from different kinds of white people. Right. White people who were seen as less than ideal compared to the native-born, Yankee, WASP stock. Now we're in a different realm, and for this, for most of our lifetimes, we've been in a different phase where, we're now putting to the test the actual proposition of whether we are in fact going to be a country that is fully inclusive of the full breadth of humanity. And a way that I put it sometimes is, this is an experiment. Can we be planet Earth's first mass, multicultural, democratic republic? No one's knocked all four of those marks before, right?
It's like landing the triple axel at
the
Olympics.
Exactly.
Like,
right?
who's going to do it first?
Can we land that, right? And we're in the midst. So we shouldn't be surprised that simultaneously, as you said, there are moments of kind of anguish and dislocation and fear at the same time that there is just kind of inexorable demographic shifts, right?
Yeah. Erik, but when we talk about like the last time there was an epic clash between white Americans and brown Americans, look no further than the Native people. And we know how that turned out. Do you think we've learned any lessons if this is part of a continuing narrative?
Well, I think, I think one of the things that's really come out to me in this particular moment is the role of a lot of different federal policies over many generations when it comes to what we see as American. I always go back to my own family history. My great-grandfather was from a reservation up in Saskatchewan, and when he was taken from his family, put into a boarding school that was part of a federal policy both in the US and Canada to assimilate children. He kept running away when I was a little kid. I never understood why did he hate the Mounties so much, and then I came to realize that one of the main reasons the Mounties were originally created was to track down Native kids, to bring them back to school. So he ended up in Chicago, and I just dug up his naturalization card from back in like 1904. Now the Nakota, are across the border, right? So we've got Nakota tribes all over in Canada and the U.S. But I look back at the fact that we had these policies like the boarding school era that removed children from families, and a lot of our youth leaders have been talking a lot about this. We have a Native youth leader who wrote for our blog about this separation of children from their families back in that era. But for us, we've tended to be the invisible population to a lot of the U.S. So we were actually one of the last groups to get the right to vote. That was being debated in the courts up through the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
So I think the other thing we need to look at in this period is that it's not just about the one, the border, the one federal immigration policy. There are a lot of different policies affecting a lot of communities over generations.
Well, and you bring up this idea of naturalizing Native people from the tribes. I can't help but think of what's happening right now with the 2,053 children who have been separated by their parents, are from all reporting that we have, separated for them, that will be separated from their parents for a very long time, if not forever. And there's a real question of, okay, let's assume these children never meet up with their parents again. They are placed in foster care. They are adopted. What happens to them, not just in a sort of survival, in the question of survival, but in terms of culture, heritage, language? By and large, they're not going to be placed with
Trauma.
Yeah, and what does that do? I mean, what is lost in that process?
I mean, there's so much, and I can only speak from our community's perspective, but the unfortunate part is that that's one of the underlying themes for a lot of these populations. I have been in many conversations with Native youth whose parents went to boarding school, who were stripped from their communities, and who are still dealing with that intergenerational trauma. We have one of the highest suicide epidemics in the entire world in our communities, and I can tell you that comes directly from those many generations of families being pulled apart, from being taken away from the healing nature of your culture and the protective factors that come from it. And I absolutely know that's what's going on with these kids at the border.
And we got news reports that a 12-year-old who was in foster care, I think in New York, tried to jump out of a window because, this was yesterday, because of the separation anxiety and trauma. Mohamed, I want to talk to you in terms of what happened yesterday in the travel ban. The Supreme Court upheld, yeah, exactly. The Supreme Court upheld the travel ban, but at the same time did something really interesting. They I don't actually know what the judicial term for it is, but they rescinded, condemned the 1940s internment of Japanese citizens in the United States, as if to say, we know some of you may think this is fucked up, but just as proof that this is not a redux of that policy, we're gonna sort of like, we're going to rescind that insofar as we can.
Yeah, sure.
Talk to me about what that dynamic highlights to you.
It's not good enough. It's not good enough because we're now in an era, once again, in this environment where you've seen the Supreme Court legitimize Islamophobia, period. And despite what all the legal scholars may interpret and what they may think and how they may see the Korematsu piece of this, the signal to so many Americans is that this is okay, that these people are suspect, these people cannot assimilate, these people will not assimilate into your country, despite generations and generations and generations of Muslims living in this country who date back to the days of slavery, when some of the first Muslims came to this country as slaves. So it sends a signal to the public, and what I often bring this back to is, sure, what happens in Washington is in Washington, and that's fine, and that certainly resonates across the country. But play this out into our neighborhoods. And the signal that sends is, it is okay to pull off a woman's hijab when she's walking through the grocery store. It's okay to walk into a grocery store or see a Sikh man and shoot him. It's okay to beat up a Muslim kid on a playground. It's okay to firebomb a place of worship, a mosque. And that, for me, is the signal that these policies send. This is systemic and institutional racism. We've seen it in the executive branch and the separation of families and disregard for that. We see it with our law enforcement and their destruction of black bodies with very little consequence. And this is more of the same message that we have to push back on. And I think, to Erik's point, this is not something new. And I'll sort of go back to, a lesson that I learned when I was in high school and participating in the YMCA Youth and Government program as a high school student in South Carolina. And I remember the director of the program, a woman named Mary Capers-Bledsoe, had given us all bumper stickers. And the bumper sticker said, YMCA Youth and Government program, democracy is not a spectator sport. And if anything, for me, it just sort of echoes that notion that a healthy democracy and healthy citizenship requires all of us, those who are comfortable, those who are uncomfortable, to play a role in making sure that the democracy functions in a way that serves all of its people.
Erik,
Can I just chime on to that? So to the point about democracy and to what you asked me before about Ocasio and the candidates, and I mentioned you have these two sides, and I think this is, if there's an upside to all of this, is that all people, not all, but many, many people are getting revved up, are getting engaged. We have all of these candidates running, on both sides, because one is saying, I want the America that I used to know, and I'm going to fight for it. And then on the other side, you have, people like Michelle saying, this is my country too. I love it. I care what happens. I'm going to run for office, and I'm going to fight for the values that I believe in. And I think that's what you see with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some of these candidates. So, on the upside of all of this is we are seeing more activism. We are seeing more people stepping up and running for office and fighting for the country and engaging civically.
Yeah.
Can I throw in one quick thought just to build on that too? And one of the things that I've observed, especially in the last few years, is that you have candidates who are running on a platform of inclusion for everyone. Despite them being minority candidates, people of color, whatever, their politics are a politics of inclusion. You have some candidates that are running based on a platform of exclusion.
Right.
And that fundamentally is against what this country stands for, and we've got to push back on that. Both parties have to push back on that.
Well, but I guess part of me, and when we look at this moment, if it is indeed a continuing part of a longer narrative, another chapter in a longer narrative, Erik, is it, it seems to me that the sort of spark or the log that was thrown on the fire is demographic reality that seems to be looming very large. America, there are different statistics for this, but America is likely to be a minority white country by 2045. And that has, in turn, led to what feels like a cresting moment of white nationalism. It's not just President Trump and his supporters. Where does that movement truly begin in your eyes?
Well, I think it's really important to frame what's going on right now. I mean, for most of this country's life, whiteness and Americanness were synonymous. Right? They were seen as the same thing in both directions. If you were American, you were assumed white. If you were white, you were assumed American. Right? And what has been unfolding during our lifetimes over the last few decades is that delinkage of whiteness and Americanness. Right? And so the demographic facts that you're describing, it's not only that by 2045 it's projected that this will be a majority people of color country, it's that among new births, we are already there.
Yeah.
It has literally and figuratively arrived, right? And that doesn't even capture all of it. I mean, the title of Alex's new book is Future Face, right? Alex's face, like my daughter's face, is the face of mixed race, right? This country is fully leaning into the idea of hybridity, right? Full hybridity, right? That you embody.
And in fact, Barack Obama is often called our first black president, but he was our first
mixed race president.
Right?
Yeah. And so I think that it is not surprising, as you say, that in a moment of that kind of shift, you get not just, I think it actually diminishes it to call it backlash politics, right? I think and this goes to some of the larger work we've all got to do in civic life right now. There's plenty to demonize out there, right? There are folks who are, as Mohamed is saying, demonizing disfavored groups, demonizing Muslims, demonizing people of color. But quite frankly, it's super easy right now in a moment like this also to demonize the people who voted for the current president. And some of them voted for him for very, very despicable, shall we say, deplorable reasons, right? But many of them voted for reasons that are much more complicated than that. And whatever the reasons were, we're in a moment right now where the challenge for those of us who believe in a politics of inclusion is, can we tell a story of us that's big enough to hold enough of us, actually, right? Not just us who are of Future Face or the father of Future Face, right? But us who want to say, you know what? There is a creed to this country that was written by white men, but maybe they made a little mistake, but the words of the creed were in fact universal, right?
Maybe it was a typo.
Maybe it's a typo, but the words were universal. And now we are getting to claim, all of us are getting to claim that creed and that language, and that's going to be complicated, and it's the birth of a new nation, right? And that's a painful process.
But it also, it's a birth of a new nation while not shedding the old nation,
Yes.
right? We talk about America becoming minority white in 2045. That doesn't mean that white folks are gone, right? And so as we write the story of America, the question is, how do we actually write an inclusive story? What happens to the strains of white nationalism that have given rise to this present moment in the years to come? I mean, it doesn't, we often talk about President Trump as if he is the sort of avatar of all of it, but he is an expression of something deeper in American society. And I guess I wonder, Mohamed, maybe we can start with you. Where does that passion, that anger, that fervor go as we become a more officially diverse society?
Well, look, so I would say as an educator, I think so many things for me go back to education. I'll share kind of one story that always kind of makes me chuckle a little bit, but left me scratching my head. My family's originally from Egypt. They moved to New York in the 70s. I was born to my parents as they were finishing their masters and PhDs. They stuck around, did not go back to Egypt, and raised me and my brother in the U.S. I moved to South Carolina in 1991, right before the start of the first Gulf War, and I remember, I think it was in like my U.S. history class when we studied the Civil War. I grew up, this is, a town in the deep South in Clemson, South Carolina, and remember hearing so many of my classmates talk about the Confederacy with such a zeal,
pride,
and such an affinity and such pride. And I remember thinking, I'd moved there from New York and got a lot of comments. People didn't ask me, people I think were more upset that I was a Yankee than they were upset that I was Arab and Muslim, which I just found peculiar, but I said, okay, I'll figure this place out.
I wonder how that trade would go
right?
today.
We talk about identity. I was like, okay, sure. But I often found it was odd that so many of my friends at the time, had such a zeal for the Confederacy that wanted, to segregate people, that wanted to enslave people. And their heroes were generals who supported this. And I often thought to myself, well, why isn't it that they're idolizing like Jimmy Carter? He's a Southerner. Why aren't they idolizing, other
Martin
figures?
Luther King.
Martin Luther King, other heroes that, Dwight D. Eisenhower was born in Texas. Like, why isn't he an idol? Why aren't they gravitating to that? Why is it that their identity, look, for all of us, if we go back to our history, whether you're German or you're French or you're Egyptian, there are blemishes in our past that we sort of have to reconcile and think about as we think about our identity and who we are. But why is it, and I kept thinking, why are these folks gravitating towards something that was so harmful and negative and hurtful to so many people? And it always just kind of left me scratching my head because there was so many beautiful things about the South that, my parents are very family oriented as Arabs and Muslims and loved living in the South because it was very family oriented and people talked about family values and there was a church on every corner. My dad loved that, right? So I think sometimes for us it goes back to education that we have to study our history and we have to understand the impact of our history on so many different communities to be able to develop that empathy. I know it's almost like a term that's in vogue, but it's important for us to be able to put ourselves in one another's shoes and get a sense of how other people have experienced history.
Well, okay, but how do we do that, Abigail? Because we're at a moment where the chasm between us and them, regardless of who us is and who them is wide and seemingly without bottom. How do we ensure that whatever the narrative is going forward, if the movement is inclusion, that there is a place for white Americans to be proud of their heritage, which is not necessarily the heritage of the Confederacy, but is white heritage.
So I agree with Mohamed on the education piece, and I think that the civic participation and engagement piece is huge. We have to tell our stories. Being invisible is incredibly destructive, and just sort of not having your stories told. And I could get into that, but to answer your question, there's a metaphor that I like to use, and I don't know if it will resonate with the rest, white America, and make them feel part of it. But we talk about being a melting pot. We're not a melting pot. Some people talk about a salad. I talk about a paella. A paella is a dish that in a big pan, you throw in the rice, you throw in the broth, you throw in the vegetables, you throw in the chicken, you throw in some seafood. And what you end up with is not a big stew. You see all the pieces. You see the chicken, you see the seafood. They're all separate, but they're all
softer.
integrated.
They're softer.
And they're integrated, and together, they're much more savory than any of their parts individually. So that is the vision for America that I would like to subscribe to, and I would hope that that is an appealing vision for everyone.
Yeah.
Can I build on that? So I really love that, because that's one of the things in building off of what Erik was saying. I think we haven't really tackled this idea of assimilation. I think some of us see that. I hear it in the news reporting all the time, like, oh, so-and-so comes and they didn't assimilate, even talking about economics, and I like the paella reference. But I think about like my daily work going out into tribal communities, and where do I sort of have conversations with rural white people? My grandfather grew up in the Indian rodeo circuit, right? And rodeo's big in Indian country. And I remember having a conversation with a pretty progressive person in the city recently who was kind of downplaying rodeo as a sport, And I said, well, don't say that anywhere out in a rural area, And I was having a conversation with someone at a coffee shop, outside of a reservation, and we just talked rodeo most of the time. I'm not really that into rodeo, but I think we also have to kind of look at what we mean by these sort of different cultural intersections too, that I think to some extent have kind of become polarized in the media and other things, but like there are these places where I think a lot of different kinds of culture have traditionally come together in different ways that is not seen out there. And those are the places that I tend to have a lot of conversations about, like Native veterans. A lot of times I get sort of an ignorant conversation, but we start talking about rodeo, and then all of a sudden I talk about Native veterans serving in the military.
Wait, but why do those conversations work in those areas? What is different about those conversations that is different than for example, the conversation happening in Washington? Obviously, the federal government doesn't make conversations, nuanced conversations, or just government in general doesn't make nuanced conversations that possible. But why does it work?
Well, I think there's a relatability to sort of everyday life, like what Mohamed was saying about the reasons your family liked living in the South. And there was a really great conversation on the media panel yesterday about the lack of local reporters now, because those local reporters can relate to those everyday things, and there's this sort of lack of a defensive mechanism that just goes immediately to what we immediately disagree with each other on. And I do think that day-to-day sort of relatability, like I'm actually pretty comfortable in rural areas as an openly gay man who lives in the city, right? But I can go hang out outside a reservation and chat with people. Talk rodeo, And that's, I think, it's those little relatable things that I don't think come out at all in some of the media a lot of people are consuming, but it is the church on every corner or whatever relates to people's daily life.
Well, if you look at this, we've had this version of this conversation, or I've had for the last several days, and one of the things that keeps coming up is the sort of key to building diverse and tolerant societies is empathy and human interaction. And one of the problems with today is we have institutional decline. People don't go to church as much. They're not as faithful. Whatever your faith is, there's not as much faith in government. And the public square has been diminished in part by technology. We are more isolated from one another. And that, combined with polarization in politics and media echo chambers, has created insularity that is really dangerous when you're trying to rebuild or reweave the American fabric in a more sort of sustaining 21st century way. Erik Lou, I was, as part of my book tours, I had a conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and we were talking about this question of future face. And I love Ta-Nehisi, right, I'm sure everybody in this room does, but he was saying, Alex, at one point I was future face. I inevitably had white blood in my background, I'm paraphrasing, and the scale just slid. And we always think we're gonna get to this point where it's all good and we're all brown, but really the goalposts keep changing. And if you're, this shade, then you're at the top, and if you're at that shade, you're at the bottom. I think that's a pretty pessimistic view, but I also think that it's worth discussing.
Yeah.
Does racial resentment just mutate in a more diverse society, or do you think we actually do reach an endpoint? I know that's a heavy question.
I think resentment always mutates, right? And in an age of inequality, in an age of scarcity, resentment will go and flow to the path of least resistance, which is along lines of race and color and otherness, visible otherness. If you look at other nations like Brazil, the fact of hybridity and mixing is itself no guarantee that you're going to, quote, be colorblind or end racism, right? You're just going to slice the bologna even thinner, and people will still think that wherever you are on that blended spectrum, lighter is still socially, politically, economically better than darker, right? And so that dynamic is, mixing alone doesn't actually guarantee anything like justice. But I think one of the things that is super important here, one of our projects at our program at the Aspen Institute is called What Every American Should Know. And it really combines some of what each of the other panelists have been talking about here, which is it's partly about education and knowledge about our actually diverse common heritage, but it's also about using conversations about that heritage as a spark for facing each other face to face and talking to each other about our stories, about our histories, about our knowledge, to match a melting pot metaphor with a paella metaphor. I'll see your paella and throw in a chop suey. There are different ways to kind of put this, but and the way we've done this project, some of you may remember in the late 1980s, an author named E.D. Hirsch, Don Hirsch, wrote a book called What Every American Should Know. It was about cultural literacy, right? And it was a kind of an academic book about how people form background knowledge and how people develop common vocabularies of understanding. But what made the book a bestseller was they listed 5,000 things that every American should know. That was their appendix, right? And this became this kind of catnip for the media at the beginning of the kind of culture wars and debates about multiculturalism and the rest. And so we revisited this book 30 years later and said, Don Hirsch was half right. An ever more diverse and diversifying country does need a common base of common language, common references. You all need to know what paella is, right? You also all need to know what the 14th Amendment says, right? And when we talk about yesterday's court decision, we talk about how, on the one hand, it affirmed the Muslim ban, on the other hand, it repudiated Korematsu. You got to know what Korematsu was, right? You got to know that that was a case brought after the internment of Japanese Americans. You got to know what the internment of Japanese Americans was. Right? You got to know not only about the Trail of Tears, but you got to know about Worcester versus Georgia, right? And these cases that simultaneously acknowledged the sovereignty of Indian tribes and then prompted the president at that time, President Trump's hero, Andrew Jackson, to say, well, the court has issued the decision, I dare them to enforce it, right? And then they went ahead with Indian removal from Georgia and the South, right? So if we don't know these facts of our history, then we're quite doomed to repeat these cycles of division. But if we do actually create an invitation to say, what are 10 things you think every American should know, right? So Mayor de la Isla, coming from Topeka, will give you an answer about 10 things you ought to know about life in Kansas, about Latina life in Kansas, that are going to be different from what James says about the work that he's been doing in the world of reimagining play and play spaces in urban areas and rural areas alike, right? Everybody's going to come to that question of what are things every American should know in a different way. That becomes this kind of key or invitation to a different kind of conversation about who is us that is less about Trump versus not Trump, white versus non-white, whatever. But it's like, hey, like it or not, we're making a common story together here. We may as well actually talk about what we mean when we say chop suey or paella and see how we deal with each other.
I want each of you to answer this question, other than Erik, because he's already answered it. But when we look at the gulf, right, and the desire to bridge that gulf, what needs to be done? Just shaking your head.
I think a lot of this, I will go back to investments in education, investments in civic education. Our history needs to be looked at because oftentimes we come at our history classes from a very Eurocentric perspective. I remember sitting in, a lot of world history classes and things that were said, I was like, but that's not true. And I had just moved actually from South Carolina from spending a year in Saudi Arabia and had spent a lot of time overseas with my family. I was like, but that's not true. What's in the textbooks are not true.
Why did you know that though? How did you know that?
Because I was in a history class overseas. And I looked at other books.
And it's because you were curious, or I guess
a little bit of everything.
Trying to distill.
I'll share with you. Part of it for me was survival. I will share with folks. Like I was a scrawny little 7-year-old, and my mom still says I'm scrawny. But in that time when folks would, she absolutely does. When I was little, folks would say, "Oh, well, you're an Iranian hijacker," and I had no idea what that was. And I remember coming home to my dad and saying, like, "They called me an Iranian. Like, we're not from Iran. What is that?" I tried to tell him we're from Egypt. My dad was like, well, tell him we have pyramids. And I was like, Dad, that's not going to help. And I didn't know what a hijacker was, but my dad told me, he said, He said, don't let anybody ever tell you you're not American, period. He said, go study. He's like, you're a product of two cultures. Study and beat them at their own game. And that's what I did. And we traveled a lot. And the more I traveled, the more I learned about other cultures. And I always loved coming back home. I always loved it when I come through customs and they say, thank you, or welcome home.
Welcome back.
I love that. I love that. And despite this country's issues, I love spending time overseas because I learn about how other people do business, how they interact, how their societies interact, the good, the bad, the ugly. And then I come home and I see our good and our bad and our ugly, and I'm able to compare. So for me, I've devoted my life to international education for that reason. My work at the Stevens Initiative, we connect young people in the US with young people in the Middle East and North Africa using technology so they can talk to each other, so they can build empathy, so they can learn about one another's histories and talk about their identity and talk about their faith and talk about their struggles and talk about their civic engagement. And they work on STEM projects together and they build careers for the 21st century. So it's things like that that we have to invest in that are worth it, and I'll say this with education. We as a country are on either a quarterly cycle where we expect results. Wall Street expects quarterly results. Congress operates in 2- and 4-year cycles. Investments in education will yield fruit in 14, 15, 20 years as a society. Yeah. It's a long-term game, and we don't have that vision.
That paella takes a long time to make.
Well, and I'll share one thing on the paella thing, because we talk a lot about diversity in this country, and that's important to have representation in our schools, in our panels, on et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Diversity is incredibly important. But I think what is more important is pluralism, because it's not just about the different colored marbles that are in your bag, but it's about those marbles making a coherent mosaic, a mosaic that works, a mosaic that displays an image that is functional, that looks good and functions well. And I think that's where we're struggling is, great, we're making some progress on diversity, we need to make progress on pluralism. And that's through education, it's about learning from one another.
For me, it's about proximity. So I'm half Puerto Rican and half Jewish. I've grown up in a very Latina family and a very Jewish family. Not so religious, but just ethnically Jewish. I lived in an all-black neighborhood in Nashville, Tennessee, and was bused to the white school with all my black peers. Those experiences shaped my understanding, my empathy, of all those different kinds of groups. I had the opportunity to live in San Francisco in a very diverse neighborhood, in a very diverse community, and I think proximity is essential. I think we need to create more opportunities for that. I think a lot of the work that we all do builds upon that. In the way that I convene on Latino issues is never just Latinos in a room. I want to learn from others. I want to share. I want people to walk away with ideas that we've jointly created to just make America stronger for all. Yeah. So that's how I go about it, and that's how I look about it. But proximity is essential to understanding, and these divisions of where we are, and I think economic division is something we haven't talked about on this panel, but I think that's another critical issue that we have to address.
Yeah, when we talk about diversity, we need to take in
it's
class
not just
along with
ethnic,
race.
and it's class, and I think that's what we're hearing is a lot of pain from the rural areas, from white Americans who are being left behind too, and so.
And the implications for that in the broader term are pretty significant. Erik?
Yeah, and building on that, I think the most critical thing right now is an intentionality around cross-cultural learning. One of the things that I really appreciate about my colleagues' approach to this work is that we have to have those proximate sort of conversations and opportunities together. We have a new program that we just started called Fresh Tracks that brings urban, rural, and indigenous youth together for outdoor leadership expeditions, and that we really use the outdoors as a safe and supportive platform for these youth from very different backgrounds to have very structured conversations with each other about, like, what does culture mean? One of the things that really impresses me is we have a culture night that's part of it. We just had one up in Massachusetts, and we have youth from, like, the Akwesasne Mohawk Reservation talking about their traditions and their cultures and what they do, and actually bringing out the idea of culture in these other youth who are coming from, like, inner city Philadelphia and New York, and realizing for the first time that, I am actually really proud of my own culture that I bring here from my growing up. And when you see that happening at that person-to-person level, like we're all talking about and on the international stage too, that's where real change is happening on the long game. And I think that we've got to work on the big systems like education. But I think anything that we can do, I know people are always looking like, what can we do, outside of some of these really overwhelming political systematic things? There are really important initiatives that we can all lead together at the community level, and especially focusing on young people. There's a reason we're seeing what's happening in New York. Young people have a different vision of what's going on right now, and that's really what keeps me getting out of bed in the morning.
Well, yeah, young people, I mean, to some degree, some people are lost, right? Just let's start them young and give them a different sense of the world. May I just take this moment before I go to questions from you guys to note, when you talk about proximity, I mean, look at this panel, right? We have a Latino Jewish woman, we have an Egyptian American, Asian American, 2 Asian Americans, a representative from the Native people. That's what we're talking about when we talk about diversity. It should not just be one or the other, but all of us.
Can I add one quick note?
Sure.
That's super important because, and Abigail touched on this, it's not only proximity. It's not just the fact that we're sitting next to each other and that there's one of each kind here on this panel.
And this is not representative of everyone.
Right.
clearly.
But it is that, as Abigail said, we've been working together. Right, we've been collaborating on different projects, and the project that Erik was describing there, to me, it kind of gets to the nut of what has to happen. It's not only education, it's not only exposure, it's not only a focus on proximity, but it is actually about getting common and shared experiences. Right, I serve on the board of the National Corporation for National Community Service, the parent entity of AmeriCorps and Vista and Senior Corps. We've lost, you talk about disappearance of institutions, we've lost institutions where people, like all of us in this room, might actually go and do something together, right? Build something together, fix something together, have to serve and make something together, right? And it's in doing that that we actually appreciate the proximity and appreciate the diversity that we're bringing here, and we don't even have to be talking about it. We're just fixing something together, right? And I think that part we've been trying to demonstrate just within the Aspen Institute by building and working together and collaborating. But I think writ large, we've got to be thinking about how we, even if you don't join or send people to national service programs, how do you create spaces like that where people can come together not just to talk about how they're different, but to build a thing that's not about me or you, but about a third thing altogether.
On that positive note, let's go to you guys for a couple questions. I know it's early in the morning, but this is a hot topic. Yes, sir. Well, I think there's a mic coming around.
Good morning. I'm John Karowski. I'm a lawyer from the St. Louis area. I'm very interested in these topics. I am the grandson of Polish immigrants. My grandmother, Sophie, came to the U.S. in 1921, February 2nd, and my grandpa, Joe, came in 1910. Within a year or two from, and I have a comment if you can bear with me, a year or two from when she came to the U.S., the immigration laws changed in the U.S. I think it was called the Johnson-Reed Act, which said only 2% of current ethnic people in the U.S. can come. And so Sophie snuck in under the wire, and she literally did. It also said no Asians, and a lot of it had to do with the Japanese political situation. And that all culminated in Korematsu. So, which I think the decision yesterday was Korematsu too. But
Yes, it was.
But it also illustrates that we sort of played what the significance of what Sotomayor did is she played gotcha on that, because they did put him into a situation where it's going to be difficult to do it again. Now, I think I'm very deeply impressed with everything you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing, because I believe that what we have, and we can't take anything for granted, is an aberration. I think Trump, you said, manifest something deeper. I don't think so. I think it's just the fact that he got elected just screwed everything up, and we can talk about that forever, because there's always going to be prejudice, there's always going to be racism at some level, but hopefully those stay in the minority. And what Trump has done has been able to manifest it because of the extraordinary power of the presidency. And so what I want to say is I have hope. I have more than hope that if we can, the election last night was huge. So if we can change the electoral situation the next 2 times and get rid of him and bring us back to where we were, I think we're going to be okay.
It's all a fever dream, is that what you're saying? What? It's a fever dream, this Trump chapter. Is there, was there a question? Just like, or maybe, okay. Feel free to share. You have the conch shell. Anybody else? right here.
Thanks, guys. My question is a big question, but how? It kind of got brought up about halfway through of how do we get this information? How do we get the 10 things that Americans should know? How do we get the curiosity and people wanting to actually look into what they're reading in school or learning about? How are we going to get to the people to give them this information, to create empathy, and with where how people are so divided right now? You talk about the chasm between us and them, whoever us and them are. How are we getting this information to them?
I think one of the things we've got to remember right now, even though so much of our attention and emotionally and intellectually is gravitationally pulled toward DC and toward President Trump, we have to remember the change that's happening in this country is happening bottom up.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's demographic, whether it's cultural, whether it's political. And the way that that's happening is in circle after circle of conversation. So how do we do that? We do that. We actually, the key word is invitation. Where do you live? What part of the country do you live in? Okay, so right here in this part of Colorado, you could be organizing a conversation in Pitkin County that says, hey, in fact, we've been partnering with public libraries in Colorado, in Topeka, in other parts of the country, to say, hey, we're going to have a conversation about what every American should know. And there's going to be food, there's going to be fun conversation, and it's going to bear on kind of what we're trying to build together in Pitkin County or what we're trying to build together in this part of whatever state. And sure, maybe the first time, 5 or 6 people will come, right? It'll just be a small thing. But you keep on inviting and you keep on creating this sense that we can have these conversations. We can invite people to say, come, this will be playful. What are top 10 things that you think every American should know? That's the spark for a bigger conversation like we're having here. In all these different ways, empathy, right? How do you do this? You practice this. You talk to the educators in your community and you ask them, hey, what are you all doing on social emotional learning in a way that's kind of culturally, infused and competent, right? Wherever we live, the circles and arenas that we are in, we've got to take responsibility for holding this up right now, right? And I think that's not to say be parochial and just do your own thing. It's recognizing that as you hold up your own corner, someone right in the next county over there is doing the same thing, and that's how this kind of change is going to unfold, I think.
The other thing that, and this has come up a number of times as we've had this conversation, if you look at the marriage equality movement, certainly there was concerted action on the state level and to some degree the federal level, but really a lot of the change came from people waking up to the fact that they had gay friends, neighbors, family members. And the proximity question really matters in this moment in particular, I think, because the national conversation is so polarized. Anything that is seen as emanating from the lords above in Washington, D.C. is dismissed or worse. And but do not give up hope on this country being a country filled with good people that legitimately do want to do the right thing. And I do think there is space for conversation, especially if it is from the grassroots up, especially if it feels natural, especially if it is neighbor to neighbor, friend to friend, family member to family member. Everybody in this room has someone in their life who has radically different ideas than them. And I think it almost begins there.
And I'll just share, take the initiative, I would say, in your community. I mean, to Erik's earlier point, when things heated up during the election, I was able to reach out to friends who I saw on Facebook. Like, I live in DC, a lot of my friends are in the Deep South. You can sort of get a sense of, what the everybody's walls look like, but there were a few times where folks made comments that I found to be, I shouldn't say just borderline objectionable, just straight up racist. And I remember reaching out to some of these folks and I said, hey, listen, man, I saw your comment, I take issue with it. I just want to let you know, do you not remember that time you came over to my parents' house and you made this comment about Muslims? My mom is very Muslim. Yes, she doesn't cover her hair, but we fed you, we played Super Mario Brothers in my basement. Do you not remember that? And luckily I was able to draw on that experience from 20, 30 years ago to say, you were in my home. My mom fed you. I went to your house for our barbecue. We were on the swim team together. What are you talking about? And then he sort of backed up and said, oh, I'm sorry, da-da-da-da. I didn't mean this, but, and I saw him course correct, and I was able to at least be able to say, okay, I see that I've kind of punctured that bubble a little bit and said, hey, listen, you really kind of crossed a line. I want you to think about your behavior. I looked at it as a teachable moment. Not to say you're wrong, you're a jerk, you're a racist, but to say, hey, listen, I think you've forgotten something about your own interaction with other people who don't look like you, who don't worship like you. And I hope you'll draw on that positive experience to frame your your outlook going forward. And I think the more we can interact with people, we all get comfortable. I get very comfortable. But the more we can have uncomfortable conversations and put ourselves in other people's shoes, I think we're better off for it.
You rehumanize.
Yeah,
rehumanize
rehumanizing is the theme of this week.
great.
We are out of time, so Abigail, I want to
Just
throw it to you.
One last thing on that. I think we really need to work on narrative change. I think we really underestimate how harmful when the President of the United States, calls a group criminals or rapists. You talked about it setting this, the stage and opening the door. We need to tell the different stories. How many people here actually know that Latinos start businesses at 3 times the rate of the rest of the population, are creating jobs when white businesses are in decline? That's an important story to be told and to uplift. If you see us only in the negative or only as immigrants, which the majority of us are not, then you're missing the whole other side of the story. And there's a whole beautiful story to be told. And so I call on the news media and I call on you, everyone, we have to work on changing these narratives. It's critical. It's really important.
Thank you guys for waking up early and coming to this scintillating and important conversation. And thank you to my panelists.
Thank you. Thanks for a great job. Thank you.